everybody. Welcome to this webinar on More Effective Teacher, More Productive Researcher. So this webinar is sponsored by AFACT, which is Academic Female Finance Committee under the American Finance Association. So we all know that we are in the business of publishing or perish. And if we look around, most all of our activities are surrounding under research. So you might want to ask why we are holding this event that targets teaching. So I think, we have primary two reasons. One is that we think that there are a lot of common and connected skills that, if mastered, could help you to become both effective teachers and successful researchers. And second, we are often asked by especially junior people new to the profession, say, gee, teaching prepping is taking so much time and is squeezing out competing for the research time, and how enough is still enough. Now, I want to mention that there's a catalyst event that prompted us to think about organizing this webinar is that AFACT sponsored a survey to all the faculty members in this profession. And we, to our surprise, found out that female faculty overall spend more time into the transition of teaching into online or hybrid format during COVID. And as a result, also incur more overall work-related stress. And this is why AFACT decided to hold this event. And we really hope that we can provide some useful and practical tips for effective teaching, and especially for junior people in research-oriented university. So today, I'm very, very happy that I have a wonderful panel, and our panel leader will be Alexandra Zamovskaya. So she is the Associate Director of C. Roland Christensen Center for Teaching and Learning at Harvard Business School. So she will draw on not only scientific insights, but also personal experience from herself and from the people she works with, and to offer practical strategies. So there are also 3 faculty panelists today. They're all assistant professors in finance. So Gisele Cespedes, so she is from the Carson School of Management at University of Minnesota. Emily Williams, she's from Harvard Business School. And Irene Yee, she's from Rotman School of Management, University of Toronto. So I will leave most of air times to the other 4 panelists, but let me start throwing out the big question. So today we have this wonderful opportunity to with Alex. I'd like to pose a question to Irene, Gisele, and Emily, say, if this is a top burning question about effective teaching in your mind, what is it? You can ask Alex now. Thank you.
I'm happy to get started on this. So one thing that I often think about is how do I prepare or spend less time preparing for teaching? So I always have these conversations with my colleagues who are, the majority of them are male, and they say, you really don't need to know that detail. And I think to myself, I really do need to know that detail, because I get grilled on all of the tiny details, and I want to work out how I can spend less time doing that really, really minutiae preparation, so that I overall have more time for research.
Okay, I'll go next. So I think many of us, including myself, don't automatically get authority in the classroom. In my case, it's partially because students have rarely seen professors that have a similar demographic profile to myself. And authority is something that I need to establish again and again each term, like even after years of teaching experience. And I think many participants in this room might also have to deal with similar situations. So I thought it would be nice to talk about how to establish credibility and authority as juniors.
Yes. So my question is more regarding how you avoid taking questions or some negative attitude from students personal, because sometimes it's hard, right? So
Yes, well, thank you. First of all, Wei, thank you for the introduction and thank you for these questions. I also just want to quickly highlight what Wei had put into chat. Also very much looking forward to your questions as you are watching this conversation. Want to make sure you also participate. Wonderful. So as we start thinking about these questions and thinking about our approaches, it might be useful for us to organize our strategies into 3 broad categories. What are we doing on the very first day, which I know is fast approaching for many of us. I'm seeing some nodding. So what are we doing the very first day? That's 1. What might we be doing throughout the term? That's 2. And hopefully the strategies in those 2 categories can help us even preempt some of the other challenges. But then the extent to which the other challenges arise, what might we be doing in the moment? And can we think ahead of time about some of the repertoire of responses that can help us in real time? So that's 3. Great. So I'm just looking around, and why don't we go to the very first day? We are heading into the classroom, whether virtually, in hybrid, in the physical classroom, we're heading there. And our students are heading into the classroom too. And Irene, to your point, when students think about a professor, especially finance professor, an image that might typically come to mind, as you've described, perhaps a white senior male instructor, that person who comes to mind would be considered prototypical for that role. Why does it matter? We know from research also that if we are not prototypical, as you said, Irene, if we don't fit that image, then the credibility and authority that's more automatically afforded to more prototypical leaders, we don't get that. So we'll think about what can we do on the very first day to start establishing our authority and our credibility. Of course, the trick also is how do we credential ourselves without appearing like we're self-promoting? Because we know from research that self-promotion can also backfire, especially for women. So how do we do that? And then how do we set expectations and norms to allow us to start building a sense of a learning community? Because we also know from studies that non-prototypical leaders are often perceived as outsiders. So how do we start moving away from me, the instructor, the professor, and them, the student? So this me versus them. How do we start turning that into us, one learning community? And most importantly, how do we do all of that while still maintaining our sense of authenticity, which we know is very important. We know from leadership research, it's important for building trust, it's important for our effectiveness, and it's also important for our psychological well-being. So let's spend some time on that first day. And Irene, you started us thinking about this. So may I please go to you to get us started?
Okay, so thank you, Alex. So just to give everyone a little bit of context, I teach a 3rd-year undergrad corporate course on corporate finance, and it's a required course for all business school students. So I think the first day of class is critical. We're introducing our students to a new topic, and students will form expectations about the course and the professor as well. And I think it will go a long way whether we like it or not. And if I can give the right impression, I think the semester will become much more easier. So I spend a lot of time to prepare and deliver a high quality class and a high quality overview. And although I'm thoroughly prepared, I think my status as a junior Asian female is not helping me in any ways. And students are used to seeing professors in their 50s, and compared to them, I might look too young to teach, and perhaps that will create an impression that she might not be an expert. And because I don't look like a harsh person, I think students might get the impression that bad behaviors can be tolerated. So I know that this wouldn't always be the case, but at least I should be aware of possibility and I should have a plan. So I usually begin my very first class with an introduction of myself. And that's when I have the most attention. And when I try to introduce myself to students, I try to erase any potential stereotype that can be applied to a junior women faculty. So for example, I would hint that I've had more than 10 years of education since college, and I will also mention that I've taught a similar course at 3 different schools. And I would also mention that I've also taught a PhD class, hoping that they can figure out that I'm not too young and I'm not too inexperienced. And I would also mention that I got my master in statistics from Harvard, hoping that students can feel confident about their professors' quantitative skills. And all of this information would be contained in about 3 to 4 sentences. And I would just casually talk about my background and my history without stressing anything. So hoping that students are able to put the pieces together, but wouldn't emphasize anything. And I would also talk about my undergrad education at Yonsei University in Korea and my PhD at USC in Los Angeles. I wouldn't, and I wasn't disclosing this information strategically, but I later found out that students found this part of my life to be interesting as well, partially because they think I can bring some non-Canadian perspective to the table, and more so because they're interested in like K-pop and they have the desire to live and study in places like Los Angeles at some point in the future. So completely wrong reason, but I think, and I wouldn't focus on the latter part, but I think some sort of bonding isn't too bad if it's not too much. So this is what I would do on the first day, among many other standard things that happen on the first day of lecture. Yep, so that's my first day.
So I can continue as well. So just to give you a background, I teach like the most basic finance class at Carson. In this class, I have students for the entire business school. So more than half are not finance major, are not that engaged in finance concepts. So in my first day of class, I think that the first day of class is very important because you set the rules, and those are the rules that you are going to use throughout the semester. Also, you set the norms and the expectations, and you start like building this sense of learning community. So my approach is to be a nice professor, but you have to be careful because you don't want students to challenge your authority. So I try to always like construct like a framework during my first day of class, that this is a class in which I'm fair, I'm nice, but I'm also fair with everyone. And especially I show that I care about the students and in particular about their learnings. I try to show that this is all about the journey. It's not about the destination, that we care about every single step and the entire learning process. So in order to do so, you need to set rules from the beginning to avoid that your kindness and being nice with the students can be misunderstood. At the end, you can end up with a lot of special requests, like extensions or something like that. So something that has worked very well for me is to show, after I introduce all the details of the syllables, I show and I talk about my research interest, which is household finance and corporate finance. So I briefly explain the main focus of household finance and corporate finance. And I try to link what we are going to do with my research. And I always try to be passionate and enthusiastic about those topics. And I think that that helps to build a sense of learning community, and that they feel that even if they don't care that much about finance, the concepts that we are going to learn in that class are going to be very helpful. And I repeat that several times throughout the semester, that the concepts that we learn are going to be helpful for them. So I think that being passionate and enthusiastic with these topics helps a lot to increase students' engagement. Something that I do at the end of the first class is to do like a short financial literacy quiz from the FINRAS website. I think that that is not for credit, that is just a fun activity to do. And it's good to set it's a good way to set expectations and to give you like a sense of what we are going to see during the course.
I can sort of build on what Giseli and Irene have told us. So just to give you a bit of context, I teach in the core curriculum at Harvard Business School. I teach basically corporate finance, and I have found through my experiences that what happens on the first day is actually really, really important. And because I've tried different things, and to kind of build on what Irene was saying, the credentialing in a kind of not a super direct way, because I think Alex will tell us that research shows that women tend to be perceived differently if they are kind of talking about themselves and their credentials. It can be taken as kind of gloating or kind of the wrong way. So if you kind of subtly talk about yourself and your experiences, so that, as Irene says, they can kind of figure out for themselves what that you've kind of been around for a long time, you've had a lot of experiences, things like that. And I'm kind of building on what Giseli was saying, the community building I think is really important. So to give you a little bit more context, I've always loved teaching, and I think kind of naturally connected with people who are new to finance. That's just my personality and the way that I am. And I've always done pretty well with the people who are new to finance. They see me as being, a safe space and someone who they can approachable. My challenge has always been connecting with those who are the kind of self-proclaimed finance experts who tend to be typically male, and I guess from their experiences professionally, they also don't see very many women in positions of authority. So it's, they have, I guess, natural biases that have come up kind of along their way. And so my challenge has been kind of, connecting with them and in a sense, winning them over. And one thing that I found really worked for me was exactly as, we have been discussing, this sense of building community. So from the very beginning, I say that, we all have different opportunities in this class. So I don't talk about them as challenges, but opportunities. We all have different opportunities. For the novices, people who are new to finance, that's fairly obvious. You're going to learn a lot about finance in this class. But for the people who have a lot of experience in finance, your opportunities are that you're going to refine your knowledge, just highlighting that there are things for you to learn, that you are going to learn how to communicate the things that you know in a really clear way to the people who really don't know that much. And that is really, really hard to do. And so I'm immediately kind of giving them a little bit of a challenge. Like, this is something that's really hard to do, and I want to see you do it well. And I found that people kind of step up to that challenge and kind of tend to be more engaged. And that seems to have really, really worked for me. So kind of getting this sense of that we're kind of all in this together. We have really different levels of knowledge to start with, but we're all in this together, and we are, and we're all going to help each other. And that has seemed to work with bringing in the kind of the finance experts from the very beginning, and that has typically worked for me. So yeah.
Thank you. So clearly we've heard that the first day matters, and it's important to think ahead of how we might introduce ourselves in the way that connects our credentials to our enthusiasm, both for the course and for teaching our students. And again, that kind of thinking of how might we strategically introduce ourselves can also translate into, for example, research conferences and other research events. And then also, how do we create the sense of a learning community? First of all, through setting expectations that signal high standard, like this idea, like, yes, and we've seen this also in chat, high standards paired with deep care for student learning. Like, why do we have those high standards? And when we're talking about this community of learners, that really includes everyone, regardless of their expertise level, because that's another set of diversity. Everyone's going to be learning new skills potentially, but everyone is learning in this learning community. And then it's nice to reference and reinforce those norms and expectations throughout the term. Let me pause here and turn it back to you, Wei.
so much, and thank everybody. Now, before we go to the next module, I'd like to share some comments sent over by my former colleague, Professor Laurie Hodgick. So when I joined Columbia Business School, she was my senior colleague and gave me many, many, many valuable advice in both research and teaching. And she mentioned here that she said that she views the syllabus as a contract which sets expectations. And she agreed with Giselle that on the first class, one should spend longer than typically down on the contract, including the schedule, materials, elements, expectation, etc. So I just want to share that. Now it's wonderful, you know, suppose we survived our first day, hooray. But the semester is still very long and ahead of us, you know, teaching week after week, the prepping could be truly exhausting. And also managing the classroom and keeping enforcing the standards, that's just a challenge. So I think, you know, we have a natural transition from the first day to throughout the semester. So I'll throw it back to you, Alex, to see what you can cover next. Thank you.
Great. Throughout the semester, what do we do throughout the semester? We already heard, we prepare. We prepare a lot. We prepare a lot for each class. And this need to prepare, especially if we feel that our authority might be challenged. Emily talked about that. That need to prepare isn't unfounded. We know that from research. Not only a sense of authority and perceived credibility might be difficult to gain, it's also easier for us to lose if we're not very typical in the classroom. So this need for perfection is certainly supported by what we know from research. What's unfortunate is that preparing more not only distracts from other activities like research, it also doesn't necessarily translate into greater effectiveness in the classroom. And this need for perfection also might not make us more effective in the classroom, in research presentations. In fact, if we're actually self-editing in the classroom the way we might be editing our papers, so we're starting a sentence in multiple different ways before ending it because we're trying to find that perfect way to relay the information, or we're using fillers like, sort of, I know some of you might be smiling right now, it sounds familiar, as we're searching for that right word, that might actually, first of all, make it harder for students to process information, and it might actually undermine our perceived competence and confidence in the classroom. So it's really important for us to think about how we might be preparing more effectively rather than preparing more. And by the way, just as an aside, it's the same idea in research. We might actually be less prolific because we're holding on to manuscripts for too long as we're trying to perfect our manuscripts. So how might we be thinking about more effective preparation? And Emily, I know you already got us thinking about that in the very first few minutes. So let me turn it to you.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, and just a disclaimer here. So I have worked with Alex for my teaching. So we recorded a bunch of my classes, and we looked back at them, and Alex analyzed them, and Alex pointed out this exact thing that she's talking about, which is that I really often did this thing where I would start a sentence or start an idea, and then I would sort of go back and try again and never really complete the sentence. In other words, what Alex calls it is sort of false starts. And so when Alex kind of pointed that out to me, I started to think about that in every aspect of my life. And I told, my family, and then we were all thinking to ourselves, oh my goodness, we do false starts all the time. So she really made me become aware of it. And the idea is that sort of as you are starting a thought and not completing it, that brings along the people that you're talking to, and then they have to go back and with you, and they're kind of, and so you're not continuing the thought, and it makes it much harder for them to learn, and really they just perceive it as you not being particularly competent. So that's what research basically shows. And it's really interesting because Alex actually asked me, what's going through your mind? So we had specific moments. She said, what's going through your mind in that moment when you were questioning yourself or doing all those false starts? And I thought, that's really interesting. So I thought about it, and I told her, really what I'm trying to do is say it in the most perfect way, which is exactly kind of what Alex mentioned. I just really want to get the point. I really care about getting the point across, and I really want to get it across as clearly as possible. And so what I'm doing then in that moment is I'm not present at all. I'm somewhere else. I'm thinking of the perfect way I didn't say it quite right. There's this kind of massive cognitive overload happening right then. And then the overall effect is that I'm just, coming across pretty unclearly, and the perception of me is, my competence perception is lower. And so this was one change that we made, where I focused on my false starts, and I think it had a dramatic effect on how the students perceived me. And we could see that, immediately in feedback. So we looked at one thing about the Christensen Center at Harvard is that they collect a lot of data on your teaching evaluations, and we could look back and see this time round, we didn't really have any comments on competence and things like that from that specific demographic that I mentioned before. And so I think it's a really, really small, relatively small change that you can make that has a profound impact. And then when I thought about it more, I'm seeing these false starts sort of everywhere, and then I actually spent time talking, thinking and listening to how my colleagues talk. And my colleagues, the majority of them, are male, and they, to me, seem to be, these fantastically competent people. And I listen to them, and actually the people who you do perceive to be as particularly competent are often the ones that have this very fluid way of speaking without these false starts. So it's actually difficult to do. It's not super easy. So what I would suggest is kind of practicing this outside of the classroom, so that when you get into the classroom, you're not thinking, oh my goodness, I can't do any false starts, because you really don't want any cognitive overload. You want to kind of be natural and fluid and present. So just practice it kind of in every other aspect of your life. And actually talking about it now makes me want to go and practice it even more. I forgot about practicing it, but it's kind of fun to practice it. So I would suggest, doing that. And it's a really small change that can have a pretty profound effect on how people perceive you. The other one are these fillers. I find that a lot harder. I'm still working on that, as you can probably hear, and I'm very, very aware of them. So yes, that's something that I am still working on, but I think that's potentially less damaging to your competence than the fluidity. So yeah, so working on your fillers and kind of being aware of that, and then kind of observing people around you, like that you admire, people that you think are particularly competent. Listen to kind of their fluidity and their lack of fillers, and it will really kind of set into your mind. And yeah, what I found was that when I made these really small changes at the very beginning of the term, then things were just kind of different throughout the term, different to how I'd experienced things in the past. So there was just less challenging of me as as a professor. The students challenged me less on the minutiae. So yes, and the other really important thing that I learned from Alex, so one last thing, is that to be present in the moment. So remember that you are the teacher, you are the person in control, and it's absolutely okay to take a moment and to hold that space and to be a little bit silent for a second. That's okay, because we often feel like we want to kind of fill in the space with these ums and ahs, kind of what Alex mentioned. And so taking a moment, holding the space is another way to demonstrate that you kind of have control, and it's a really small thing that you can do kind of on a day-to-day as you're in the classroom. And all of these things apply not only to teaching, but are so relevant for research and seminars and things like that. So yeah.
You have to turn on your audio. Giselle, we cannot hear you.
Sorry.
Oh, yes, that's great.
I want to add a couple of things from some advice that I received when I started teaching. So probably most of you have heard that it's important to spend a lot of time the first time that you teach. And I think that is like one of the best advices that I received, like spending enough time. Don't overdo it, but try to make the content yourself at the beginning. It's going to save you time the second and the third time that you teach. So making those small changes when you are teaching so the material is done for the next semester was very helpful for me. Also, something that I did was I was teaching 3 sections. So I was trying to tweak the material, the things that I felt that didn't work with one section, I improve it with the second one and put that done and never touch that again the next semester. So spending time at the beginning is going to make your life easier the second and the third time. And don't be shy. Ask your colleagues and the senior faculties about the material and all the material that they have used for those courses is very helpful as well.
Thank you. And so Emily and Gisele started us thinking about some of the behaviors that we can enact in the classroom that doesn't necessarily make us be someone else or act like someone else. And it can actually make us effective, both inside and outside the classroom. And I want to spend a little bit more time thinking about other behaviors. I'm also seeing some comments in chat from Jeanette, for example, pointing out that it might be important to be vulnerable. And this question around how might we be vulnerable without self-deprecating or undermining our competence, I think is also very important. And Emily also talked about this role of students who perceive themselves as experts in the classroom and thinking about how might we navigate that through certain behaviors. We already talked about, even at the very beginning of the introduction, how do we set this community where everybody feels that they're learning? And also in the moment, how might we model for students? Who is an expert? Can we actually expand their views of an expert? For example, calling on a female student who has expertise in finance, or international students, or bringing in students who might not necessarily have expertise in finance, but have expertise in other fields, which might provide very important insights to the discussion. So I'm very curious to hear about other perspectives. And Irene, I know you also have some examples from your own teaching.
Yeah, so several years ago, I noticed that textbook problem sets tend to have more names, men names than like women names. So for example, questions would start like, David is the CEO of company X and is trying to select projects, or it might also go like Bob is trying to create a replicating portfolio. And this might implicitly create the impression that financial decisions are usually made by men, and perhaps the problem sets were written decades ago and not revised since then. And when I try to write my own questions, I just try to be mindful of the balance, gender balance, and which I think is really a small thing. It's really nothing. And I don't know if it has any impact on students, but at least it makes me feel a little bit more comfortable. And I also think that most finance courses tend to focus on US and Canadian firms. I don't think there's anything wrong about it. And given my education, I would be scared if it is not the case. But whatever possible, I would try to talk about like other countries and other perspectives and companies in non-US and Canadian countries as well. So for example, if I'm talking about a hypothetical multinational firm, then I would just pick one country from each continent. And when I talk about optimal capital structure and the factors that affects companies' capital structure choice, then in addition to the usual like financial frictions, I would briefly mention that the meaning of that can be different can be affected by culture or religious belief. And I once asked if students from Islamic countries were willing to teach us what that means to them, and students were too shy, and I had to explain with the very little knowledge I have. But I think it's just interesting to hear about different perspectives, and at the same time, I think these small gestures can like create a mutually respectful and inclusive environment.
Thank you. And so just to emphasize, talking about this long-term also impact, not only these practices can have those benefits for us as instructors, as I said, both in the way we teach, also in the way we present research, it sounds like they can also have a very profound impact on our students as they become more effective leaders. And reinforcing this throughout the term can be very, very helpful. So Wei, let me turn it back to you at this point.
Well, thank you, Alex, for helping us to navigating throughout the semester. So now we come to the most juicy part of the panel discussion, which is in the moment, because during the semester, inevitably, we will bump into some challenging situations. It could be a negative comment a student makes during the class, or students try to push you with unreasonable requests. So despite we have these general principles about enforcing standards, setting up expectations, but when that moment comes, what will be the practical tips to deal with it? So Alex, I throw back to you.
Yes, those challenging moments in the classroom. And Emily already talked about cognitive load, and now you're in the moment and potentially cognitively overloaded. We've heard already some of the challenges. Students questioning us on general premises or specific details. We also even seen the question in the chat around student asking for extensions on some of the deadlines. And even if the student simply gives us a wrong answer or an unclear answer or a tangential answer, even that can present a challenge. And that's because it makes it difficult for us to navigate what we've already been alluding to several times, both in us talking and also in chat. How do we navigate being nice and being competent? And that's a really important challenge, because we know from research that women are generally perceived to be higher on warmth, this idea of being nice, and lower on competence compared to men. What's even more problematic, though, is that these two dimensions seem to be inversely related for women. So the higher we are perceived on warmth, the lower perceived on competence. And then we gain in competence, we might actually lose on warmth. And that is also problematic because there are certain expectations, we call them prescriptive stereotypes of how we are expected to behave. And so if we're expected to be high on warmth, then we can't really afford to lose that without experiencing backlash. And that backlash can show up in many places, including student evaluations. And students might not necessarily even be aware of their biases, which is why it's really important to think about how we might effectively find that balance. We already used an example of introductions when we pair our high standards with also signaling explicitly that it comes from a place of deep care for our student learning. But I'd love to spend even more time thinking about how we might navigate that balance effectively. And let me see, who would like to get us started on the panel? It's an open question. Irene, please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, so I do have a lot of experience handling various requests from students. So during my teaching semester, I have to handle more than 400 students and their requests as the course coordinator, although not all of them are my students. So I can talk about how I can stay professional without sacrificing the warmth dimension. So it's obviously stressful when I receive like deadline extension requests or regrading requests or a makeup exam requests, like they're just emotionally challenging, and especially if the request makes no sense. So I first take a deep breath and think about the situation from a third person perspective. And I think the answer is clear in most situations. So as Gisele mentioned and Julie mentioned, the course outline usually states the policy. And even if that's not the case, I think I can use my common sense to determine what's fair to all students. And if I'm not sure, I can ask my colleagues. So although dealing with gazillions of requests is like stressful, I think I know how to proceed. So in that sense, I think it's not that hard. So I first try to handle things just professionally, say yes to requests that are valid, and I would decline the rest. And then I wouldn't worry about complaints or evaluation at this point. But then the next question becomes like how to avoid any potential backlash. And as we discussed, we might face even more backlash if students have different expectations on women. So in my view, I think there are different dimensions of being nice. And as long as I genuinely care about students, I think students are going to know that. And I think most students are not going to complain about that one deadline extension request that I declined. And there might be one or two students who still complain, but even so, I just cannot sacrifice everyone else. And that's just what it is. And I think there are different ways of saying no. So I try to think whether my response makes sense to the student that made the request. And I also try to be as transparent as possible. And I will try to communicate that everyone is treated exactly the same way. So that means that it would be unfair to other students if I give an exemption to just you and not to other students. And I think as long as students perceive that they're respected in some ways, I think half of the problem is already solved, regardless of the outcome. So I think this perceived trade-off didn't become much of an issue for me as far as I can remember. And I think we shouldn't think that students are going to hate us if we strictly follow the course policy. And I think we don't have to be harsh, but I think it's okay to be strict. But I think if we instead try to be nice in every possible way, especially because that's what's expected of us, then I think we might be inclined to give exemption to a subset of students, and then other students will also ask for exemption, and then I think this can potentially turn into a bigger issue. And I think stronger students will eventually feel that they're disadvantaged, and that's when we can look weaker. So I think the first best scenario is to have a life without any nonsense requests. We briefly talk about what we can do. But I know that that first best scenario doesn't apply to me, at least in the foreseeable future, because I have to deal with hundreds of students. So I think it's nice to have a protocol here.
Okay, I can also add regarding challenging moments. One challenging moment could be like how to deal with wrong answers from students. Let's say that you pose a question and you find a student that gives you the wrong answer. So the challenge here is just to, you want to correct the student and show competence, but you want to also encourage participation, especially if the answer is coming from a shy student that usually doesn't participate. So once I read that the key is to avoid saying no or the answer is wrong. So, and the non-verbal communication is key when you are dealing with situations like that. So I think that being positive, enthusiastic, help in the moment, saying something like, Mary, thanks for your participation. You were very close, but the answer is blah, blah, can help the student feel better, and also helps to build this sense of learning community that we want to do.
I can just, add two more points that are relatively broad, but hopefully applicable to things you might have experienced. So one thing is kind of dealing with pretty aggressive questions. So for example, it's pretty obvious what's happening to you in that moment. If someone is asking an aggressive question, it's pretty obvious that, so they're kind of challenging you. And in that moment, it's really easy to start, it's happened to me. You start thinking, oh my goodness, this is awful. Like, it's really obvious what they're doing. Like, they don't perceive me to be particularly competent. It's kind of like almost like a bit of an attack via a question. And it's really easy to just feel overwhelmed at that point. And I think a great strategy is to, again, kind of, it's so easy to say, be present, take a moment, hold the space, give yourself a second to think, and don't allow yourself to kind of respond immediately with a kind of, and so just hold the space, take that moment, be present, and that will automatically give this impression of control that you have, and give you a few more seconds to think about how you're going to answer it. And then sometimes there's that fear and that question where you're so worried that you're not going to know what the answer to that question is. And it's just everybody's worst nightmare that someone's going to ask you something in front of all these people, you're not going to know what the answer is. And so tips that I have for dealing with that have seemed to work are, again, taking this moment to pause, then also kind of rephrasing their question, making sure that you have got their question right to start with. If it is really confusing, if it's really confusing still, then to try to unpack it, and say, let me just make sure that I am understanding correctly. And then also, this is buying you time to think about it. And then once you've done that, maybe throw it out to the rest of the class, what does everybody think to this? And then that can also buy you some more time. Obviously, if it's kind of tumbleweed and there's nobody answering anything, then you really have to kind of say something, and you can kind of just say something. But remember, you're the one that's in control, and that you are the one that they're looking up to as the authority figure. So kind of what you say goes, if you can say it kind of confidently, if you really don't know what the answer is. So I think a lot of that is really easy to say, be present and try to hold the space. And I am still learning how to do this, but I think it can really, really help. And I just want to add that these things that you do kind of throughout the term, throughout the semester, of being more fluid, no fillers, starting off by, on the first day, introducing yourself in a way that kind of builds community, you credential yourself correctly. I think that all of these things are so impactful that you actually have more scope to use these tools in the moment, because you already have that. They already think of you as being competent, that you kind of won them over in a sense. And so it gives you a greater ability to handle the in the moment difficulties that come up.
Great, thank you. And I'll just pick up, Emily, where you left off, this idea of thinking about the arc of the course. What can we be doing on the first day to lay that foundation, and then reinforcing it throughout the term? And if challenging moments do arise, how do we stay in the instructor role? Because students might be focusing more either on our gender identity, our ethnicity, nationality. How do we stay in the instructor role? It's, Emily said, might be harder said than done, but it requires some of the mental model in terms of, I'm going to stay in the instructor role and either pursue with intellectual curiosity, or I will ensure clarity around the answer. So I will not let the clarity go away at the cost, right, of being afraid to appear less nice. At the same time, being clear on what's right and what's wrong in terms of the answers, while celebrating the contribution. Like, thank you, for example, Emily, for really helping us understand the important area of confusion. So even though you're pointing out that there is a clarity issue, but at the same time, we're all part of this learning environment. And then also modeling. This is also modeling for them how to be leaders. And potentially you might even bring in some of the research when relevant to highlight some of the biases, again, without now putting them, students, on defensive. So really thinking about this long term and over the whole arc of the semester. So Wei, let me turn it back to you at this point.
Well, thank you to you all so much. So we have covered the topics that we set aside, but I have received many great questions. So we still have about 10 minutes to address those. But first of all, I encourage everybody to read a comment to everybody from Tony Whited about how to deal with jerks in classroom. That is great. That is a very Tony comment. Thank you, Tony. Okay, so I'm reading through a questions list, and most of which we have touched upon, discussed a little bit, but let me start with a question that we haven't quite touched upon. So Jeanette Perez pointed out that the students today are very different from students a generation ago for when I was a student. So one thing that in the past, students resort to professors for most of the knowledge or information related to the course. But today they can Google, they can YouTube, they can obtain information from online courses. So establishing authority of knowledge, meaning something very different. Then relatedly, Ariki Malmadir pointed out that today's students actually enjoy talking. Now, if they want to talk, it might be a win-win situation, meaning we can speak less and potentially also prepare less, but it's not quite that, because the student talking could potentially lead to areas or topics or issue that the faculty member hadn't quite prepared. So how do we allow students to talk, but also put a arrange or boundary all those talks so that the class remain focused and we remain in the leadership. So I think that would be, I combined the two questions to see whether the panelists have anything to share.
I think I can maybe answer that question. I think that it's quite specific to the dynamic that you've created within the classroom. So for example, at Harvard Business School, the students have this thing called Slack. We all know what Slack is, where they can basically chat to each other. And when we were teaching virtually, they couldn't, there's no possible way that I can enforce that they can't talk to each other. But so I knew that they were doing it throughout class, but because of all these other things that we put in place, I believe that they came to tell me afterwards that it actually really helped them. They were kind of just clarifying things, and they were kind of doing this thing where they were, you know, talking amongst themselves, but in an electronic form, and helping the class kind of move forward. So obviously they were telling me the best side of it, and it wasn't like that maybe 100% of the time. But I think that if you manage to work on all these other things kind of from the beginning through the term, then you can maybe be more flexible and allow certain things like this. So you're kind of, you know, like talking but I really think it's quite specific to the dynamic that you have built up and you've worked on. That's just my thought.
So just to build on that as well, I think it goes back to this idea of learning community and engaging students, because this is what really makes this a learning community. We're going to learn together. Again, regardless of your expertise, there are different skills you can develop. And so if you can really bring students in conversation, experts, they might actually need to learn how to explain in a way that actually brings people along with them. Or they might need to think about implications. They can run the numbers. Well, what are the implications of that? Or how do we even get those numbers? And similarly, novices might come up with a different question that, because we've been so much in the field, we might not even consider it. So I think this idea of celebrating from the day one that we're going to be learning together, and this idea of really making it interactive. We're not just giving them information, but we're really helping them, A, to build intuition, and B, to really be effective communicators, thinking creatively and thinking together. Again, I think it's going to go a long way to solidify what we're really doing, which is learning, not just transfer information from the professor onto the students.
Thank you. So I raised to the question. I think I can also combine the question from Cecilia Palatori and Brittany Lewis. Basically, it's a trade-off between approachability or personability and authority, how personal we want to get into the classroom about ourselves, or prompt the students to think about identity. So for example, Brittany mentioned on the first class, should you explicitly ask students, hey, what do you think a finance professor should be or should do? Should we prompt that question? And Cecilia also asked in the classroom, should we mention, say, hey, I'm from Argentina, or mention, say, my kids, this and that, so they know you're a caregiver, you have a life with certain elements in your life, etc. So what is enough, or what is appropriate, and how would it make them to help you rather than potentially compromising any rigor or authority? Thank you.
Yes, and I think that also goes back to this question of vulnerability versus, you know, this idea of self-deprecation, or transparency versus inner voice. Again, transparency, vulnerability, I think can go a long way. Self-deprecation, inner voice, not so much. And so this idea of how much you want to be disclosing about your personal life, let me disclose a little bit about my personal life. And in terms of the examples from the classroom, because I also think a lot about how do we want to bring in the sense that we're all humans, we're all learning, all of us, at the same time not undermining the very credibility that we've talked about. How do we build that? And so on the very first day to this question, I'm very purposefully, but very truthfully, bring up an example when I first went to the classroom, which also helps to highlight that it's been a while, going back to Irene's point. So I highlight it's been a while. When I first went to the classroom, the advice that I received from my advisor, which is a true story, was go in there and do not be yourself. And I actually share that very purposefully on the first day with my students, and you get the reaction. Because again, what we've talked about, students have changed. Authenticity became much more salient. And so I get the reaction, and then I clarify, I say, well, and as I was receiving this advice, and that's advice that they might receive throughout their careers too, I needed to find out, what do you mean exactly? Talking about identities, which part of me, because I'm multifaceted, which part of me should I not be in the class? And then the professor said, well, you're gonna go in there. You're very informal. I don't know if you noticed that. I'm very informal. You crack jokes. Not all of them are funny. So you crack jokes. You're not that much in terms of the age difference from your students. And so clearly, and by the way, I tell all of that to my students, the story that I'm telling to you now. And so the advisor told me that the students might have really hard time perceiving you as an expert, despite you having PhD from Yale University, despite you have a National Science Foundation grant, despite you being valedictorian. They will not even know that. And you can't bring it up because you're gonna face backlash for self-promoting. So you have to do it indirectly. And then I paused and I said, kind of the way I've done it now. And students notice that I just, so self-promoted without self-promoting, and they have heard, the way you just heard, some of my qualifications. And I don't know, and for you, did that change your mind, the way you perceive me now that you know all of that about me? I mean, that's a really good question. We should really stop and ask that question of our students. So I do make that explicit, but I tie it into our learning, and I tie it about them. I say the types of judgments. And in the finance class, we have a diversity of perspectives. So we have a diversity of experience. And we are sometimes afraid because we'll be judged. And I tell them that explicitly, all right, that we might, be holding back some questions because we think we might be judged. So I'm really tying that to the learning objective. And I tell them that it's really important that the judgments we're making, to understand that these judgments are telling us more about ourselves, why we're making the judgments. What is it that we're assuming about the person based on their identities before even knowing their credentials? What is it we're assuming? So the judgments that we're making is more telling about us than about the person we're judging. So I'm almost making this idea of vulnerability and transparency. I'm making some of those elephants transparent in the room. I'm acknowledging that, which also helps to build the community more because they might also relate. So I'm not just randomly sharing stories, but I'm telling them true stories that I think might be connecting to their own experience and that can help us to come together as one community.
Thank you very much. Yes, Giselle.
Just to
Giselle,
add
you want
to
to add
that,
something?
yes, just to add briefly something at that point. I am a new mom. And this year, after introducing myself and explaining my research interests and all my credentials, I mentioned that I was a new mom. And I think that helped me because on top of all my credentials, I was showing a part of my real life, and the students appreciated that. I received some comments saying that the professor is not only an expert, but also show me that it's a real person. So at the end, I think that can help.
I really think there are a lot of more questions, and we can spend another session of time to discuss, but time's mostly up. So let me wrap up. Let me thank everybody who participated in today's event. So we want to highlight that the issues that we covered today, for example, how to communicate importance of materials, how to demonstrate our competence without invoking backlash, how to establish authority without really compromising our authenticity. These skills will be useful for teaching, but will also useful in research and also community and community and reputation building. So AFACT, as an organization, we will continue to host events like this, aiming at help people to succeed in our profession, especially junior faculty members and members from the underrepresented groups. So thanks everybody, and stay tuned in for our future activities, and please continue to support us. Thank you very much. Thank you.